The rumor always surfaced after the third beer in any Special Forces bar. Someone would lean across a sticky table, lower his voice beneath the jukebox, and announce that during the Cold War, the U.S. Army trained a platoon of psychic commandos who could kill goats with a single stare. Most listeners chuckled, pictured helmet-clad Jedi Knights squinting at livestock, and wrote it off as veteran folklore. But in 2004, the British journalist John Ronson followed those whispers into a non-fiction book, The Men Who Stare at Goats, and the legend spilled onto the mass stage. 5 years later, Hollywood released the film version with George Clooney, Ewan McGregor, Kevin Spacey, and Jeff Bridges, ensuring that millions now think some corner of the Pentagon once fielded goat-killing clairvoyants. Is the story true? Like so many tales lodged between secrecy and satire, the answer is neither a full yes nor a flat no. It is an interwoven fabric of verifiable projects, half-remembered field anecdotes, New Age idealism, bureaucratic turf wars, bored counterintelligence officers, and a single semi-credible claim that somebody, somewhere, watched a goat fall over after a stare. Unpicking that fabric requires traveling back to the late 1960s, when the United States felt it might be losing its first war, its students, and its soul. America's scientific establishment had spent 2 decades winning the nuclear, ballistic, and computational races. Yet by the late 60s, against a backdrop of jungle ambushes in Vietnam and civil rights marches at home, some uniformed thinkers wondered whether traditional metrics of power missed subtler domains: human perception, consciousness, will. Lieutenant Colonel Jim Channon, fresh from combat tours and nursing a disillusionment with both bureaucratic hierarchy and hippie dismissal of soldiers, took a Pentagon-funded sabbatical to wander West Coast communes. In dome houses outside Santa Cruz, he sat in drumming circles, chanted with yogis, watched people bend rebar with their throats, and filled notebooks with sketches of warrior monks. Channon's epiphany arrived at Esalen Institute above the heaving Pacific warfare could evolve from killing to convincing. A soldier who mastered his own mind might disable enemies by awe, by empathy, by the radiant confidence that pacifies aggression. In 1979 he delivered a thick, lavishly illustrated briefing booklet titled The 1st Earth Battalion Operations Manual. Its pages proposed silent step training, biofeedback breathing, holographic projection, hearts on helmet decals, sparkly-eyed stare-downs, and spiritual karaoke. Channon claimed these techniques could end conflict without a shot fired. He visualized shock troops meditating in formation, transmitting omnipresent goodwill until opposing units dropped weapons from sheer existential confusion. The Pentagon shelved the manual, but, it circulated below formal channels like cult scripture Xeroxed again and again. Young officers at Fort Bragg and Fort Benning pinned Channon's glam psychedelic diagrams to barracks walls. The seeds were planted. Maybe the military could steal a page from the counterculture and weaponize human potential. While Channon sketched cosmic soldiers, Army medical teams at Fort Bragg ran a decidedly practical program, one that would become the scaffolding of the goat myth. Special Forces medics needed to treat gunshot trauma under pressure, so the Army established a live tissue training facility deep in the North Carolina pines. In chilled rooms nicknamed the Goat Lab, anesthetized goats were shot with pistol rounds. Trainees practiced airway management and field surgery until the animals either stabilized or died. The method was gruesome, effective, and by 1980 routine. Several former medics later told journalists that during off hours, certain officers snuck into the lab to run parapsychology experiments, staring at a goat's heart while monitoring an EKG, attempting to slow or stop the pulse with thought alone. One veteran, Charles A. Pete Hutt Vacha, swore he had witnessed an animal keel over shortly after a colonel's fixed gaze. Yet the lab logbook lists no anomalous cardiac arrest, and contemporaries either dismiss the claim or shrug. Things were loose back then. Somebody might have tried. Who knows what anesthesia mix the vet tech used? What is certain is that the GOAT lab existed. Psychic rumors definitely brewed inside it, but just to be clear, documented proof of lethal stares does not. A parallel storyline unfolded on the other side of the continent, funded not by the Army Medical Corps, but by the Defense Intelligence Agency, and occasionally, the CIA. In 1972, physicists Russell Targ and Harold Puthoff at Stanford Research Institute won a small contract to test remote viewing, the notion that human consciousness can see distant locations or hidden objects. Early trials impressed DIA officers enough to bankroll a standing unit at SRI called Grill Flame, later Center Lane, later Sunstreak, and finally Stargate, each codename change marking a bureaucratic reshuffle. Over the next 2 decades, a stable of civilian psychics and soldier intuitives sat in dark rooms, recorded spontaneous sketches of Soviet missile silos, and attempted to locate hostages or submarine designs. According to declassified project histories, the viewers occasionally produced startlingly accurate drawings, like an offshore crane for a disputed Soviet salvage ship, but mostly delivered fuzzy, metaphor-laden impressions. Independent evaluations put their success rate barely above chance. By 1995, Congress, hungry for post-Cold War budget cuts, canceled Stargate and released summaries to the public. Tabloid headlines screamed Pentagon's secret psychic spy squad, exposed but within intelligence circles. The story ended as one more footnote to the Cold War's weird hardware bazaar. Nevertheless, the existence of Stargate proved the United States government would seriously consider paranormal research. Combine that fact with Fort Bragg's GOAT Lab and Jim Channon's Cosmic Manual, and suddenly the goat-killing legend felt almost plausible. Almost. Any truth-seeker investigating psychic soldiers stumbles into a darker vault. Edgewood Arsenal and Project MKUltra. From the early 1950s to the mid-1970s, the Army and CIA tested nerve agents, hallucinogens, sonic weapons, and sensory deprivation on volunteer soldiers and at times unwitting civilians. While these programs predate the GOAT lore, they created a bureaucratic template for unconventional research and a trail of ethical wreckage that later remote viewing skeptics invoked. If the government secretly drugged its own, why not secretly train telepathy? Edgewood's legacy fed conspiracy mills and, more quietly, nurtured institutional caution. When the Stargate budget lobbied for expansion, agency lawyers waved Edgewood autopsy photos, "We can't survive another scandal." Thus, the chemical hauntings indirectly circumscribed psychic spending, ironically protecting taxpayers from an even larger remote viewing bill. The single most quoted anecdote in Ronson's book describes a Special Forces colonel who, after months of meditative practice, walked into the Fort Bragg GOAT lab, stared fiercely at one animal, and watched it slump, hard arrested. That scene, honestly, rests on a chain of secondhand retellings. There's no laboratory data, no veterinary report, and no necropsy forms to corroborate the event. Yet retired Master Sergeant Mel Riley, who was actually an original remote viewer, insists he heard about it from a reliable lieutenant. Journalist John B. Alexander, himself an advocate of non-lethal weapons, says he could never track down the primary witness, but the rumor still circulated widely in the early 80s. Here is one plausible genesis. After a routine medic shoot-and-treat drill, a goat under anesthetic died unexpectedly. An officer standing nearby, maybe even just gazing at the animal, joked, "Look, my psychic power did it." The trainees laughed, repeated the joke, and months later the quip hardened into legend. Memory, like a bad photocopier, amplified each duplicate until the tale reached Ronson's notebook as an established feat. Whether the lethal stare happened or not, its sticking power reveals a psychological truth. Cold War soldiers, steeped in technocratic firepower, secretly thrilled at the idea that consciousness alone could trump bullets. So, in the late 1990s, Ronson began chasing the intersections of war and weirdness. He interviewed Jim Channon out on Hawaii's Big Island, tracked down Fort Meade's remote viewers, including Vietnam vet Joe McMoneagle, who insisted his coordinate remote viewing once located a Soviet Typhoon submarine, and, yeah, he even cold-called GIs who had cleaned goat stalls. The resulting book braided verified documents with deadpan dialogue, leaving readers to decide for themselves where footnoted fact ended and rumor hallucination began. Hollywood screenwriters, well, they smelled cinematic gold. Crafting a screenplay, they compressed several real personalities, Channon Alexander, project managers at SRI, into Bill Django, played by Jeff Bridges, a hippie colonel who teaches soldiers to dance like clouds. George Clooney's character, Lynn Cassidy, borrows bullet points from Joe McMoneagle, Ed Dames, and other remote viewers. The goat-killing scene, central, grotesque, and oddly comic, made the final cut because that's how cinema digests ambiguity. When truth is messy, just show the legend. Viewers left theaters believing the United States Army once trained psychic assassins. But, few actually read the epilogue subtitles explaining the project's uncertain efficacy and eventual shutdown. After Stargate's declassification, the American Institutes for Research tasked statisticians to analyze 2 decades of remote viewing transcripts. Their conclusion was that, well, some sessions scored above chance, but not enough to justify operational deployment. Meanwhile, neuroscientists studying brain imaging data repeatedly found no evidence that thought can influence distant cellular processes beyond quantum-level noise without an electromagnetic carrier. Similarly, attempts to replicate psychokinetic goat heart rate modulation have failed under controlled lab conditions. One 2010 veterinary study measured EKG changes in 90 goats, while volunteers attempted telepathic deceleration. Results aligned with random drift. Parapsychologists counter that psychic phenomena might refuse to manifest under skeptical scrutiny. That laboratory sterility, chokes the psi field. Skeptics reply, extraordinary claims demand extraordinary proof, not excuses. Though official psychic programs ended, odd research still trickles through defense contracting. DARPA funds what they call cognitive prosthetics and synthetic telepathy using neural interface headsets. The Navy, on its end, explores anticipatory human-machine teaming, hoping that brainwave analysis can, predict a sailor's intent just milliseconds before action. Such projects rely on hard-nosed neuroscience, not extrasensory perception, yet their marketing blurbs sometimes revive that classic First Earth Battalion rhetoric. Peak cognitive performance, seamless situational awareness, even a so-called sixth sense for threats. Meanwhile, public fascination with military paranormal history has, honestly, blossomed into hobbyist remote viewing workshops, YouTube goat stare parodies, and plenty of off-color memes of soldiers glaring at barnyard animals. The Army's modern medical corps, eager to finally shed the Goat Lab's lingering PR stench, replaced live tissue training with high-fidelity digital mannequins and synthetic hemorrhage rigs. Goats can exhale in peace, even if the myth, well, insists otherwise. When distilled to verifiable components, the men who stare at goats narrative looks like this. The US Army did in fact use anesthetized goats for trauma training. DIA and CIA undeniably ran multi-million-dollar remote viewing programs. A single officer actually authored a psychedelic manual envisioning psychic warrior monks. Experiments in chemical mind warfare, Edgewood, M. Keltra, show the government's willingness to, probe ethical boundaries. No official document confirms a goat killed by stare alone, though at least one soldier insists he saw it. Why does the unverified heart-stopping moment overshadow the documented programs? Because myth offers clean catharsis. If staring can kill, then consciousness transcends physics. The warrior monk has achieved transcendence. Bureaucratic memos about 30% hit rates and statistically non-robust aggregates feel tepid by comparison. Standing in a quiet pasture on a modern military medical base, no goats now, only humming, lifelike mannequins, a young medic might recall the goat legend with a chuckle. Yet the tale endures because it reflects something more than eccentric research budgets. It mirrors America's recurring hope that there is a shortcut past physical limits, that technology or spirituality, or the perfect fusion of both, could erase the brutality of combat, rendering war an exercise of minds rather than bodies. In truth, the story of psychic soldiers is an archaeological layer of faith. Faith that somewhere between atom bombs and acid rock the human spirit might still evolve. Sometimes that faith funded breakthroughs. Biofeedback now helps PTSD veterans. Sometimes it funded dead-end labs where bearded men drew pyramids and labeled them enemy ordnance depot. Yet even dead ends chart the map of a culture's imagination. And what of the goats? They remain the unspeaking witnesses. Whether or not a heart ever halted beneath a soldier's stare, their place in the legend ensures we will keep asking uncomfortable questions about where science ends and yearning begins. Like Schrodinger's cat, the goat both died and didn't, depending on which observer opens the box. Until irrefutable evidence surfaces, the goat exists in a quantum state, one hoof in fact, one horn in folklore, reminding us that the human urge to believe can be as stubborn and as funny as a goat staring back.